Welcome back. This is panel 10, themes in Africa. My name is John Unruh. I'm with the Department of Geography at McGill University. We have four pretty interesting presentations this afternoon. I'll remind the speakers to please keep to 20 minutes so that we can engage in some interesting and robust discussion. Please, if I can get you to raise your hand, your real hand or your virtual hand, in that discussion period, so that that we can get your comments, that would be very much appreciated. First up, we have Gwyn Campbell, McGill University and the IOWC. He's going to be talking on the 1863 regicide of Radama II of Madagascar, reinterpreted in the light of human-environment interaction. Gwyn, over to you.
Okay. Right. So in 1863, Radama II of Madagascar was killed by his own inner circle. He'd only come to the throne in 1861 after the death of his mother, Ranavalona I, who lived a long reign. She reigned from 1828 to 1861, and had quite a bad reputation with Europeans, whereas Radama reversed that reputation by opening the doors of Madagascar. She closed them and he reopened them, but was almost immediately killed. And this explores, most interpretations have dealt on the fact that it was a political coup, that there were traditionalists within the inner party that followed his mother, and that they couldn't stand his pro-Western open door policies. But I want to focus in this paper on the contribution of environmental factors to the crisis, notably a severe drought, which hit in 1862-3, followed by major epidemics. Now, this is Madagascar, as you can see. It looks tiny next to Africa, but is the fourth largest island in the world. It's about 2.5 times the size of the UK. And within that island, right up to the present, virtually, something like, even today, something like 90% of its population are engaged in agriculture, and most settled groups are engaged in risiculture, and that certainly pertains to the highland group that we're going to look at today, which is in Merina in central Madagascar. So we're talking here about not the east coast, but the central plateau, which is from 8 to 2,800 meters high. It's a plateau that runs on a north-south axis, almost the entire 1,500 kilometer length of the island. This is a map from Sibri, from a missionary in the latter part of the 19th century. He spent a long time there, so he was he was a naturalist, a very keen observer. He was an architect. And what most of the people note is that it was chiefly granite and nice rocks. The summits of all the hills, in fact, were made of hard rock and overlaid at lower levels by hard red laterite, which made cultivation very difficult until marshland risiculture was introduced in from the 17th century in response to famines. And that was a period of intense drought in which hundreds died. And the ruling authorities responded to that by building dikes along the major rivers and converting the marshes, their extensive marshlands, into rice fields. And the most spectacular of which, the Betsimitata, which lies just to the west of the present-day capital of Antananarivo. At the same time, because of population pressure and the danger of famine, the ever-present danger of famine, which led to, or was probably a major contributory factor to civil wars in the 18th century, they not only converted the lowlands to riziculture through draining the marshlands and building dikes, but also introduced cultivation techniques which converted the hillsides into paddy fields. And this is an example, you're more familiar with those with Indonesia, but exactly the same pattern was adopted in highland Madagascar. The most spectacular was probably Betsileo to the south of Imerina, but Imerina also had them. Here we have it again. So Jones, for example, noted of Antananarivo, which was perched on a hill in the middle of the central plateau. The country around it is very hilly, and on every little eminence, there is one or more villages. The low ground is well cultivated, rice grows luxuriantly in it, and it is well watered by the Ikupa River. Now, the population was entirely dependent. The famines of the early and mid 18th century had proven this. The population was thoroughly dependent upon rice. There was very little else to sustain them, which posed a problem in terms of the self-sufficiency of Imerina. However, by the end of the 18th century, they were producing 2 rice crops a year. There's another, this is James Sibrey, the architect, again, describing central Imerina, saying there are innumerable slopes, but the slopes are terraced with rice plots, like great green staircases, where the grain is first sown broadcast and from which the young plants are taken up and transplanted into larger fields along the banks of the rivers. That is the Betsimitsatatra, just to the west of Antananarivo, an aerial view. You get the same one here. There's a French photograph taken from Antananarivo on the right. That's it again. However, it was exceptionally labor intensive. It needed huge labor investment in terms of building the dikes and building those terraces that you saw in the photographs, and in controlling the water that came down through them at the right season in order to grow the rice. It was essential that rice seeds and shoots be nurtured in water, otherwise the topsoil hardened, exposing the roots to a quick death in the sun. It was also, laterite is pretty infertile, and so it needed quite assiduous attention in terms of fertility. So bringing, for example, human or animal excrement to mix into the soil. And here you've got a description of the best type of fertilizer that they could use. As I said at the bottom, it worked in intense labor investment, which was organized by the central authority. It was done at community level, so there was community investment in it, but it produced by the end of the 18th century 2 rice crops. The entire agricultural cycle in the highlands was thus dominated by riziculture. In the Merina dialect alone, there are a minimum of 72 words to describe different types of the rice plant in various stages of growth. It was so important, there's LMS missionary Griffiths commentating it was the staff of life. It was so important that it was called, in fact, a god. It was one of the few, as were sovereigns, when they died, they were called gods. Well, even in life, they were called gods. The point being, however, that it was absolutely dependent upon rainfall, and rainfall was highly seasonal. So here you've got a typical rainfall season in the highlands of Madagascar, and you see there that you get plentiful rainfall from basically November, December, January, February, but then an exceptionally dry period in the southern hemisphere winter. It can be on the plateau, it can be not only very dry, but very cold. And people become susceptible to, very susceptible to diseases that affect the lungs. Now, I need to emphasize the labor intensity of this. First of all, as we said, the topsoil needs to be broken, and they use these, what they called angadi, these long forks. And then the seeds were nurtured by a sort of gender division of labor. The men broke the topsoil. The women then nurtured the seeds in nurseries, and when they were ready, transplanted them into the fields. But they had to wait until the fields had to be flooded. Water was essential throughout. So you've got heavy labor investment, heavy water investment. In September, the rice nurseries were flooded. And then in October, the start of the rainy season, the main fields were flooded. And all this was very carefully controlled. Any breakdown in the system could threaten the entire crop and might well bring famine. Such large quantities of water were needed that streams almost dried up, and the level of the Ikupa River, that's the main river next to Antananarivo, fell to the point that it was easily fordable. In other words, these are human beings manipulating water flows. Then in the smaller fields, and here you see a picture of men driving cattle through, these then churned up the topsoil and enabled the rice to flourish. Then we've got the year passes, we come into March, April, and we get the rice harvesting. This is near Antananarivo, and then the threshing and the storage. And you see it's on stilts to protect it from, basically from rats. Now, despite the comparatively heavy investment of human and animal labor, the yields on the plateau were inferior to those in the coastal wetlands and of forest swidden riziculture, which required comparatively little labor-intense investment. The average Merina family of 4 to 5 working 330 days a year on 1 hectare of land produced between 2,000 and 2,500 kilograms of rice. However, all this was not just dependent upon labor investment, it was dependent upon environmental factors. Locusts could devastate a crop. Wind could devastate it, hail could. And there are plentiful records in the 19th century, which is of it being impacted by such factors. But of course, water was of the essence. So rainfall was critical. I have just 2 quotes referring to the factor of rainfall. Now, this wasn't just the only factor, but here we've got, it needs rainfall, but it needs labor investment. And following the 1820 treaty between the Merina and the British, with British help, Radama, the authorities in Merina, built up both an industrial experiment, where by the 1840s they were producing a whole gamut of industrial material from cannon to silk cloth, and they built up a standing army. And there you see on the right the number of soldiers that were in that standing army. Now, the reason you get such a high number of recruits in those years is because the mortality rate was huge. The people from Merina did not have the sickle cell anemia, which would protect them, or protected lowland populations against malaria. And Radama and Ranavalona his successor, set out to try to subjugate the entire island to Merina rule. So they sent troops from Merina, highly trained. The British had trained them well, highly armed, well armed with what were then sort of modern day muskets, into the lowlands, but they were unprotected against malaria. They also proved particularly inept at fighting against pastoral peoples who adopted a kind of, they just disappeared whenever the Merina armies turned up. But ensured that the Merina armies did not have provisions to sustain them. So you've got very high mortality rates, chiefly because of malaria. I'm pointing to this because when you have such a large number of young men being drawn out of the agricultural workforce, this is just into the army, but you also have them into the industrial experiment, then these are being plucked out of agriculture. And agriculture is very heavily labor intensive. And you're drawing the prime labor out of it. The people, the young men who are required to control the water, to manipulate the water, and to engage in riziculture. You're drawing them out of the villages and leaving the villages highly vulnerable, much more vulnerable than prior to this era, so prior to 1820, to environmental factors, sort of hail, locusts, and of course, that's an indication of, you see Lake Anousi, it's around there that you had the early industrial sites in the lowlands, below the hill, to the west of the hill on which Antananarivo was built. Again, thousands of men were employed building that lake, and building the canal that went to that lake, that it was water power that fed the gunpowder mills at Isuraka. And then behind that, if you look up to the northwest, you've got Cameron's house and workshop. That's where he produced the early muskets, as well as ironwork. Huge numbers of conscripts were summoned to Antananarivo in order to train before they were sent out on expeditions. And with the high mortality rates, the recruits were then summoned to Antananarivo to also train. If you look to the bottom left, that is called Mahamasna. It's the training ground that was built to train the troops. You can see just to the north of it, that lake again, Lake Anousi. And you can see the brown bits, this was drawn by Karim. The brown bits are the newly settled outskirts of Antananarivo, where the industrial and military personnel settled, and with them came their families, because they were summoned on what was called Fanampuna, but forced labor, unremunerated forced labor. So they were dependent upon their families to feed them, to clothe them, and to generally sustain them. So not only were troops and industrial workers summoned in to Antananarivo and its outlying districts, but the families came there as well in order to sustain them. So you've got on the left a rough indication. We've been trying to collect as accurate data as possible, but most of these are estimates, but nevertheless, there is an indication from the estimates of a rising population. This is just Antananarivo, a rise in population. Now, of course, this then puts added pressure. Antananarivo is the only really urban center of Madagascar in the early to mid 19th century. Tematav and Majunga are mere villages in comparison. So what happens in Antananarivo can have major consequences in terms of disease outbreak or in terms of famine. So I said rice was so essential that the Malagasy considered it a god. Too much rain or too little rain at critical junctures could ruin the crop. Over time, a number of beliefs about the climate developed include, and they've got, and I refer to Yadav's paper that he gave yesterday. These are cyclones to hit Mauritius in 1861-62. 62 was a major year for cyclone damage. I haven't been able to collect the information on Madagascar, but probably quite a few of these hit Tamatave. I don't know how much damage they might have done sort of further inland. But a major drought hit Madagascar and the Imerina in 1862-3. And we're talking about the Southern Hemisphere summer. So this is around mid-December to the end of February. Critical period when it threatened the rice crop. At the same time, we have outbreaks of disease, leprosy, malaria, a rat invasion, smallpox epidemic, locust plague, and a curious phenomena called Ramanengina, Imananengina, Choreomania, or the dancing mania, which was directly associated in previous accounts. It's been associated with the events leading up to the death of Radama II. But in this context, I think we can legitimately try to tie it also to environmental facets. Now, how do you prevent a catastrophe taking place? The Malagasy practice many taboos which could avoid it, and these are a number of them. These are all associated with rice. You don't sit in a doorway. You don't allow grass or straw to lie on the floor. You don't crush white stones, etc. But Fadi, when Fadi failed, you brought in Sampi, which are talismans, and each clan had a Sampi, but the chief national Sampi are the ones that counted in a major drought, such as that of 1862-3. And these are the four main ones. When they failed, a chief Psikidi or diviner was called in to identify the sorcerer or witch with the supernatural powers that are believed to cause the catastrophe. Generally, a stranger was the main subject. Now, this could be a slave, it could be a European, as was the case earlier in the 19th century. 1825-26 drought, probably blamed on James Hastie, the British agent. 1828-29 drought was definitely blamed on Robert Lyle, who was expelled as a sorcerer. And that of 1862-3 was probably, and this is the Ramanengina, this is the dancing mania that broke out, female dancers coming up from Betsileo in the south, speaking in the name of the dead queen Ranavalana, warning Radama that he had transgressed ancestral taboos, that he had broken ancestral taboos by opening up the land to Europeans and to Christians again. They made straight for Antananarivo, where they identified William Ellis, the head of the LMS who was there and had forged a close friendship with Radama, as being the main culprit. And he had all sorts of kind of objects placed on his windowsill, etc., to try to ward him off. But Radama II was scared silly because these people were speaking in the name of his mother, who just died, and he believed them. There she is, the queen, and she'd another tradition spread. This was different from the Ramanengina, although they came from the same area. This again is Lambundru Bay, the citadel of dead sovereigns down in the southeastern, on the borders between Betsileo and the forest. And it was believed that she had risen from the dead. In Madagascar, the dead have as much influence, if not more, over things that happen today. And traveling in a cortege up to Antananarivo to warn her son to change his ways. So towards the end of February 63, it started, and it reached Antananarivo. There's a vivid description of the dance as they produced as they marched forward to Antananarivo, musical instruments, clapping of hands. They had hallucinations affirming they could see Ranavarana. And hey presto, within a few days, on April the 24th, Radama ordered people to obey the Ramanenjana, who had ordered them to remove their hats, the hats being a symbol of European influence. On the 1st of May, he was seen running through the streets of Antananarivo with his head uncovered, not wearing a hat, chasing his son, who was himself afflicted by the Ramanenjana. This presented traditionalists at court with a chance they'd been waiting for, and they ritually strangled Radama on the night of the 11th of May and massacred his Menamasu followers. Ellis, for months, believed that Radama was still alive, but following the assassination, the epidemic ceased. The government, the Conservative government, took power and ordered that anyone who was caught dancing would be put in irons for life. And the new queen, in accordance with the traditionalists, she brought in new measures. And I would add that Radama had been going to abolish Whanapuna, the forced labor regime, but they obviously kept it, brought it back in, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gwyn. Much appreciated. We'll move on to our next speaker, Philip Gooding, also with the IOWC at McGill, will speak on environmental change and political instability in Equatorial East Africa, 1876 to 1884. Philip, over to you.
All right. I assume everyone can see my screen. Is that a yes? All right. Good. Okay, so this presentation is essentially about trying to put, that's that one. Put this figure here from a publication by Sharon Nicholson and Zhongjian Yin on rainfall conditions in Equatorial East Africa in the 19th century, as inferred from the record of Lake Victoria, put that figure into the political history of Eastern Africa, 1876 to 1884. So what is this figure? This figure is a record of 10 lakes, the estimated record according to lake sediments of the levels of each of these lakes in different parts of Africa, mostly around Equatorial Eastern Africa. And to varying degrees, all of these lakes represent rainfalls in their catchments. Some of them represent rainfall in their catchments a lot more closely than others, but taken collectively, I think you can kind of make some broader regional conclusions. There are two patterns which I kind of want to draw your attention to, but the main one is this. Here is 1880, and this goes through here is 1880 here, and this dot here is the dot that goes through all the way up. That represents 1880 in all of the lake levels. And you will note in all of these lakes, at least as far north as Lake Stephanie, but not Lake Chad, which is a lot further north up here. In 1880, we have quite a significant dip in all the lakes. Here we go. So Lake Ngami, we've got a dip there. Lake Chilwa, we've got a dip there. Lake Malawi from around 1880. Lake Rukwa as well. Lake Tanganyika is slightly before. Lake Victoria as well. Lake Naivasha as well. Lake Susquehanna as well. So yeah, we ignore Lake Stephanie and Lake Chad. Those are the two most northern ones. So we can kind of draw a line there. And then the other pattern is here, at least north of Lake Ngami. So we'll cross this one here too. We can talk about a rise in lake level from around 1840 or 1845. So Lake Chilwa, Lake Malawi, Lake Rukwa, we're talking about rises from here onwards. What is this representative of? Well, up to 1880, from about 1800 to 1840, at least on these figures, because that only goes back as far as 1800. We can talk about generally uneven, but generally low levels of rainfall in much of equatorial Eastern Africa. In fact, some recent paleolimnological records have suggested that from about 1780, Eastern Africa experienced a long enduring drought. And this is representative of some of the phenomena that Matthew Hannaford presented yesterday on Southeastern Africa and Mozambique, of basically a general period of climatic instability during the last years of the last decades of the Little Ice Age. Following the Little Ice Age, which finished in the 1840s, in Eastern Africa and the wider Indian Ocean world, we had warmer and wetter conditions, and this is reflected in this in the levels of lakes, which are all rising from 1840 onwards. Then they reached a peak in about 1878, and then they all dramatically declined again. And this is again, and this is generally seen as basically the period leading up to the European scramble for Africa, which is why is widely acknowledged that there were frequent droughts and generally below average rainfall. And that's essentially what's going on here. And I think this second change, the one that I outlined first, but the second one chronologically, the one from 1878, is really worth noting in the context of the political history of the region. Just to kind of emphasize this more, that there are other kind of climatological sources we can refer to here to support this kind of general pattern towards below average rainfall from 1878 onwards. And that is from rain gauge data. We have rain gauge data in Kampala from 1879 and in 1879 and then 1881. We have it in Mombasa from 1875. We have it in Zanzibar from 1874. And from this rain gauge data, Nicholson, again, so the same author, same climatologist, has made some basically estimates on the level of rainfall across the entire equatorial East African region. And these broadly align with what we've kind of discussed, that from about 1878 onwards, we have frequently below average rainfall, particularly in the October and November. This is the short rainy season. It's the point at which most crops are planted. So when the crops are most vulnerable to being, when they're most vulnerable because they're youngest as well. The only exception to this I want to point out is this here. This is massively above average rainfall in the October-November season. This is 1877. And this is a massive ENSO anomaly, positive El Nino, and a positive Indian Ocean dipole, which is, I suppose, made famous in international world circles in Mike Davis's late Victorian Holocausts, which many of you might be familiar with, even if some might disagree with some of the overall conclusions. In any case, the raw data is available for all these rain gauges here. Which I'm assuming you'll be able to copy the link across from the recording. And as I said, massive positive rainfall anomaly in October to November 1877. And then there are frequent droughts thereafter. The most notable ones which I want to draw attention to, though, are the ones in 1879 to 80 and 1883 to 1884. These ones are the most significant because they went across the entire growing season. That is, they set in during October to November, but then they endured as well during the long rainy season in March, April, May as well. During the whole growing season was affected by drought. We can talk about some broader global climatic teleconnections here. I've mentioned the 1877 to 78 El Nino. Should point out that the year before this, 1876, was a year of drought, which is broadly in line with models that project El Nino's effect on East African climate as well. That the year before an El Nino sets in is usually is associated with drought, hence why I'm starting this study in 1876, because I think the first significant drought in this period does occur in 1876. Then we have floods resulting from the El Nino, or above average rainfall resulting from the El Nino in 1877. And then we have the drought in 1879 to 80, which can be associated with an extreme La Nina, extreme according to Joel Gurgis and Anthony Fowler's proxy record, which I think a lot of people will be familiar with as well. And then 1883 to 1884, again, this is the year before an El Nino. It's been suggested to me by Stephen Rockwell this might have been a year of negative Indian Ocean dipole as well, which I'm actually quite persuaded by, but I haven't quite incorporated it here as well. But I think possibly more significant is the influence of Krakatoa, the Krakatoa eruption in 1883, which disrupted atmospheric circulation and sea surface temperatures in the Indian Ocean, which probably contributed to the drought as well. Just an illustration of the depth of this drought. The Kampala rain gauge for September 1883 to May 1884 suggests that says that there are only 594 millimeters of rainfall during this growing season, which is 61% of average, which is, well, it's a pretty massive drought. So what does this mean for a political history? What am I trying to do here? As far as I'm aware, and I'll be very interested if someone wants to correct me on this, no one has yet put all this data, and this was just a very quick summary of it. I have more bits and pieces that I can add to. No one has put this into conversation with the political history of the region. And I think there's a massive opportunity here. I suppose it's quite normal, well, it's quite a popular phenomenon to do now, to think about the links between, I suppose, adverse climate and climate changes and national security and political stability more generally. So just as a thematic standpoint, there's an opportunity, but also there's a massive opportunity because the period 1876 to 1884 has recently been, or at least in the last 20 years, has been identified as a period of heightened political instability in Equatorial Eastern Africa, including, in fact, especially in the two major states in the region. Now, the two major states in the region here that I'm going to refer to are the one centered on the one of Mirambo's domain, which is centered on Urambo. That's around here, centered on Urambo here. And also the other one is Buganda. So this is the area here, which is broadly around here. And these are very, very sketchy outlines of where they were. Buganda and Urambo had influence on the southern shores of Lake Victoria, for example. And these two states were led by two giants of the region, essentially, or giants of the historiography. One of these is, so in Urambo is led by Mirambo, and Buganda is led by Mutesa I. Both of these leaders died in 1884, coinciding with this significant drought, which I've just identified. Though I'm not actually going to draw any connections between their specific deaths and the drought. But in the older historiography, so things dating from the 60s and 70s, their deaths signified the declines of their respective states, which never recovered. After Mirambo's death, his state essentially ceased to exist. And Buganda descended into civil wars before succumbing to British colonial rule. The more recent historiography, by contrast, has suggested that both Urambo and Buganda were experiencing and struggling to cope with significant political instability before this time, and that it is argued that their apparent rapid declines post 1884 are worth considering in light of longer-term destabilizing factors, which was certainly apparent from the mid-1870s. My essential contention here is that climate played a significant role as well. This is not to negate the roles of other factors attributed by other historians, such as factional disputes, economic troubles, military failures, but it is an additional factor, and one which I think underpins some aspects of the other destabilizing factors that have already been identified. In addition to this as well, when we identify climate as a role, I want to say that climate had a different role in each of the two states mentioned, because each state was vulnerable to the effects of drought and the effects of adverse climate in different ways. So the point is here to say that I'm not being deterministic on being a climate determinist here. The change in the climate had different effects in both Mirambo's and Buganda's states, but despite these diverging effects, both can broadly be related to trends towards political instability. So I just want to give you kind of a summary of what I'm kind of arguing here for each state. Firstly, we're going to refer to Urambo, which is under Mirambo, of course. So Urambo is named after Mirambo. Urambo is actually the name of a town. This was a military, commercial, and administrative centre, and it rose remarkably quickly. In 1858, according to Richard Burton and John Hanning Speke, who are the first Europeans to travel through the region and to document the area on documents, there is very little in this region, and the largest town in its vicinity only had 150 huts. But by 1878, so 20 years later, Urambo was a large town of over 15,000 people, and then it continued to grow thereafter. This feeding such a large body of people when before there wasn't one required significant structural changes. First of these was expanding the labor force through slave raiding and trading, and this is definitely a feature of this period. But the other one, which I think has been neglected in historiography somewhat, is the adoption of new high-yield crops. The principal ones here are maize and rice, which are have significantly higher potential yields than sorghum and millet, which are the African staples that they often replaced. These are new arrivals to the region. Rice had been on the East African coast since about 1000 AD, but had not made it to the interior until the 19th century. By the same token, maize is a new world crop, and again, made only into the interior in the 19th century. In the 1860s and 1870s, I believe that the addition of the utilization of these crops was highly efficient. This is a period of a highly abundant rainfall. However, the problem with both of these crops is that although they have high potentials, they are not resistant to the effects of water stress, i.e. droughts and floods. Thus, I argue from 1876 onwards, the first drought of the era, and then subsequently frequently below average rainfall with a couple of years of droughts that spanned more than one season, that major shortfalls occurred. Mirambo's policy in this context was to expand his domain and raid for food from peripheral regions. His arrival in Usukuma here, just on the southern shores of Lake Victoria, he only went in Usukuma for the first time in 1876, at the same time of this drought. He went into Usukuma again on raiding purposes, again in 1880, again during the drought. Apparently in both years, according to missionary sources, Usukuma was abundant, including in maize, suggesting that rainfall was more abundant there than it was in west central Tanzania in Mirambo's domain. And while I think this was possibly successful in securing these shortfalls in 1876 and 1880, the drought was too widespread in 1884 for it to work again. And by this time, Mirambo's enemies had essentially learnt techniques to resist him. Frequent droughts and thus increased raiding encouraged people to develop better military strategies to resist. Just before Mirambo's death, he suffered a series of inconclusive battles just before he died. Basically, in this context, I'm basically saying that the adoption of maize and rice to feed large numbers of people increased the chance that violence would be needed in years of drought. And this gradually weakened the political center as it became increasingly able to assert itself militarily. After Mirambo died, his successor, Mpandasharo, focused on developing agriculture, and the peripheral regions essentially all revolted and refused to send tribute, thereby signifying the collapse of the state. Buganda experienced somewhat similar patterns, but they're also different. Buganda was not, the political instability in Buganda was not so much related to a change in agricultural practices. Buganda is banana country, and this did not change during the 19th century. Also has higher annual rainfall than West Central Tanzania, and thus making it less prone to famine. Although famines did occur, most notably in 1880 and 1884, according to missionary sources. In this context, it's probably worth noting that Buganda's capital grew as the administrative and commercial center during the 19th century. In about the 1850s, it had about 10,000 people, but by 1895, it had 70,000. Again, this is a massive demographic growth in an urban centre. It's a massive urban growth. Mutesa I secured food for the capital through requisitions from rural areas, obviously increasing the pressure on the capabilities of the food producing sector of the rural economy. And this, according to missionary sources, contributed to famine in both 1880 and 1884. But probably the bigger issue in this context was that during 1883 to 4, there were massive outbreaks of smallpox, smallpox and bubonic plague in the capital, and bovine pleuropneumonia or lung sickness in rural areas. These are undoubtedly to my mind related to drought. Smallpox is frequently tied to drought. Several studies have acknowledged this, not just in the Indian Ocean world. Drought and famine have contributed to the increased mobility of people, spreading the disease over larger areas, and then subsequently, smallpox finds reservoirs in places where people might expect to find food or wages to buy food. The Uganda capital is a prime area in this context. Bubonic plague, by contrast, is usually associated with flooding or above average rainfall. This is because humid conditions are more conducive to fleas' reproductive cycles, and also when there's abundant food, rats are likely to spread over larger areas. But also bubonic plague can find centres during periods of drought. Bubonic plague was and remains endemic to parts of Uganda and is endemic to the region around the Uganda capital in the late 19th century, including in its rural areas surrounding it. When there is very little food in these rural areas owing to the drought, rats are forced to find other sources, including from humans. And in this context, the Uganda capital was the best supply here. And basically, plague-ravaged rats left rural areas and increasingly entered the food stores of the capital. And in this context as well, Uganda houses being made from papyrus provided ideal nesting conditions for these rats. Thus, in this way, drought likely contributed to an epidemic of bubonic plague in the Uganda capital as well. And similar patterns occurred in 1888, 1889 too. The result of this was, according to missionary sources, around 10,000 deaths in the capital.
If we could have you wrap up.
Yep. The result of this is a mass fleeing of the capital into the famine-ravaged countryside, which was being devastated by bovine pleuropneumonia at the same time. It was during this disaster in the capital and in rural areas that Mutesa died. It's well known that his successor, Mwanga II, failed to assert a cohesive authority thereafter for a multitude of reasons. But here it is argued that climate played a significant role in undermining the central authority leading up to his succession as well.